Today is January 24th. It's 1 p.m. This is a Prescott City Council study session. We'll start with roll call, please.
Mayor Good,
Present.
Mayor Pro Tem Montoya,
Here.
Councilwoman Cantelmi. Here. Councilman Moore.
Here.
Councilman Barusing.
Here.
Councilman Sischka.
Here.
And Councilman Tenney.
Here.
All are present.
Very good. We have two items on our study session agenda today. First one is the quarterly update for the Mayor's Commission on Water Policy Review and Monitoring.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. Leslie Grazer with this Prescott, obviously Public Works, and your staff liaison for this Mayor's Ad Hoc. The one on the desktop is not it. There we go. Okay, just some brief slides as usual, and then open it up for questions and comments, or happy with questions and comments along the way. So where do we stand? Just a quick rundown of the first quarterly update that you had in September. We were at a set of questions were being developed and used to move the group through a review and monitoring process. So we have 7 people who all have different experience levels and different interests, and we were finding out a lot about those interests in the early parts, but we kept trying to pull them back to a structure because their input is valuable. At the same time, we had a very, I think, clear mission in that we received from the clerk's office. The purpose was for the review and monitoring of the city's updated water policy. So we tried to do the best we could, and you've seen this slide before, but this is what it was looking like at the meetings. Let's talk conservation measures. How about Big Chino Water Ranch? Can we do the worm, please? We really need to know more about that. Use is greater than contract volume, it seems. Let's talk about that. How about landscape water use? I'd really love to talk about landscape and outdoor water use. And as I said, you have a very skilled group. Well, what about permanent recharge? We should talk about that. Continued growth, safe yield, assured water supply. And the list would be even more, but I stopped there because as we've continued to have meetings, there's more things that come up that they would really like to tackle. So the outcome, each policy in the 22 water management policy would be reviewed. So that's where we were at that first quarterly update, and that's when I started building a matrix that they could work on and provide input. So your second quarterly update today is in January, obviously in January. We had meetings in October, November, so 2 hours together, and then there was no meeting in December. But we did meet just last week, so I was pulling together their information as quickly as I could for this meeting. Our timelines are a little bit, we usually have 2 weeks to, requirement to get this ready for council. But the policy review matrix was established and commission members provided input. The same matrix, I was aware with the deputy director that she was calling for a 6-month review of the policy with staff. And so I offered that as well to a meeting. Let me back up. So the policy review matrix pretty much started October. November, their homework was due. The deputy director for Public Works was also working with staff. Had called a meeting. And so they were preparing their comments as well. And we're going to look at some of those today. Let's see, the commission was asked to provide some feedback in comparing the 2019 policy to the 22 policy, and then the 22 policy to a long-term water plan. And the reason why this was done, and you'll see in the matrix review, I had fairly limited input. I had 2 members who completed the matrix and gave information, and I had staff, which was likely a combination of multiple people. I sat in briefly on that meeting when that was held, and then the information was going to be rolled out to me when they were, had their thoughts compiled. But with only 2 members, excuse me, responding to the matrix in its entirety, I started looking at, I don't know if the commission had an idea of the range of water planning you can do. So we did a quick comparison, and we have some feedback a little bit, but not so much. And I'll kind of categorize how that came back. So you were in a tough situation in December 22. On the 20th, you were looking at how are we going to budget this water for the next 6 months? What are we going to do with an appeal process? So seeing that, they also were given some additional homework over the holidays where I sent out the tape and the minute number to start and review what you were grappling with and to see, what kind of feedback I would get from them as well on that. So I'm going to move through this slide. Okay, so let's look at this policy matrix that was provided to you in hard copy or electronically as well. And I'm going to see if I can switch to that on screen for just a moment. Okay, it looks like I have it. Thank you, Sarah. So what you're seeing here, we'll walk through this. I gave everybody instructions on what their job was. And so they needed to start telling me, okay, if you want to look policy by policy, you need to be telling me, when you read that, is that effective to you? Based on the other information I'd given them in the table. Is it not effective? Or are you uncertain? Because I was seeing uncertainty too, and that's because you have folks that aren't operating your water policy every day. There are people who work in different capacities in this community. So I set them up with, as you recall, your policy set up with different blocks, new applications, existing contracts. So I set up the table that way. Each policy number was written down. I looked at, is there data available? And yes or no. Do we have data available? Because as you recall, they said, we want data. We want to talk with numbers and things. And that happens in different ways with our different members. Some of them want billing records so they can look at outdoor water use. Others want an idea of what's coming out of the Easy Street standpipe, basically, where people can come and pick up water. So I also set them up so they were ready to go. Is this currently tracked on a regular basis? And so this was going to help them move towards a decision. And then in the notes, if there was a reference for the item online already, they had it so they could go to that. So here's where we have the input coming in. So we had 2 members who completed this in its entirety. And member 1, I'll just say, I received their comments on November 8th. And then after that person reviewed the tape from the 20th, the council meeting, brought back more comments. So you're going to see things that are just in regular type font, is what I had on the 8th. And then if there was additional comments that they sent on the 12th, it's going to be in italics. And I'm pointing these things out because there were some interesting, more leaps that the group was making. And this is member 2 that submitted information. I received that November 15th at the meeting, I believe. They had put some information down. And then this is the staff input, and this was received on December 22nd, 2022. And there's not necessarily did the staff do the effective, not effective. They provide a lot more text, and that is also actually very helpful. So I wanted to show you that, if we look at just the members at this point, we have members who, one would say, okay, it's effective, and the other one's uncertain. And if I got the whole 7, it would, it would help in elevating which policies are the most critical. It's hard for us to play baseball ahead. We try to, but, would we have known that you were going to have some decision-making on appeals potentially because of an application that was over budget at the very get-go? So I want to just scroll down this a little bit, if I can, without the mouse running away. Okay. So here again, we have, one says, oh, yep, that's effective. The other one's like, wow, I'm uncertain. And you're going to see that pretty much running through. So I don't, I have to figure out how to help our commission as a staff liaison elevate, and it'll be professional input too. Which ones, do we need to be elevating? This one talks to cost benefit. So I'll just give you a quick look. You've probably already looked through these, I hope, in kind of seeing how we're kind of working to have 7 people give you feedback, and not just feedback, but address maybe aspects of the policy that you would like to maybe make more effective. Let's go back to the top real quick, because this is helpful too, to show some of the dynamics that are happening. And I apologize, I know it's hard to watch this scroll by. So if we have 2 members, kind of not on the same page in terms of how they feel about it and how their review. Staff input said, for new applications, for existing sites that are already developed, for example, an internal remodel or a change of use, the site plan process is moot. There is a cost for site plan review. In many cases, there are no changes to the site plan. Is there another way to achieve public outreach other than through a plat or a site plan? Some projects are required to go to the Board of Adjustments, BOA, and the Planning and Zoning Commission, and the Water Issues Subcommittee of the Council. This is redundant for the applicant. Keep in mind that BOA decisions cannot be appealed to council and the council votes on the water requests. So I think this is an interesting perspective, so I'm very thankful that when I offered it to the deputy director, they were able to sit down, and they were already going to sit down, but now we've captured those comments. So what you're seeing is that you have a commission that is working towards the goal that you're asking. You also have another perspective of staff that are saying, wow, we're operating this thing, 5 days a week. We have contact time with a lot. Well, these are the things we're seeing. So I don't know if you have any questions on this specifically. Let me see if I can find if another example would be useful. Let's roll down here a little bit to the budget section. So that's starting at like 11, right in here. Okay, so your policy's broken down into a budget. So you had, was nice. You had 2 members who said, yep, it's effective. Yes, it's effective. Yes, it's effective. And I think what they were pointing to is could see online the efforts that were made to show, when somebody came in and there was a deduction from the 25 acre feet. Staff said no concerns on this aspect, but then you get down to the no single applicant can request greater than 50%. So they were saying, okay, yeah, that's effective. One member initially said, would suggest adding language to require a cost-benefit analysis as required elsewhere instead of ambiguous language about demonstrate benefits. After watching your council meeting, they provided additional input and said there needs to be a specific set of guidelines for approving appeals. The council mentioned Palmer Apartments, which would require a full semi-annual allotment from the water budget. The council mentioned things like it's a good project because it provides workforce housing, yet there is no guidelines on that, on what to make a project attractive to the city and what doesn't. Seems like a recipe for lawsuits. And I'm sure there's more lawsuits for the projects exceeding the policy where appeals are not approved. Oh, there's more. The review of appeals cannot be subjective. So over here, you can see staff was, they returned this on the 22nd, but they were saying clarification was provided by council on the 12/20 meeting that projects that appeal the 50% rule are not included in the water budget. So this starts giving you, and this is what, I'm doing my best here to capture, which items need to be elevated. You're seeing that there is a mix of, process in-house, and there's other examples of this here. There's processes in-house that are challenging, and then you have a group of 7 that are also working to give input for what to tackle next. This, this could be where we have to look at your 7 members and team them up, and because they want to work on certain things. Specifically, as I had mentioned, you have a section on conservation at the bottom and landscaping. So I guess overall, I just wanted to make you aware this is how we're capturing these things, so we don't have a willy-nilly kind of way of trying to move 7 people into some decision-making and to help with what you're seeking. I did want to bring up the 75%. That was another interesting one, actually. Return flows. Okay, so this policy here, new development will be connected to city sewer before potable water is delivered. And then it has a second kind of piece to it. It says, new non-residential shall return no less than 75%. And so in working up the information I could, we didn't have a lot to work with that I could give them. But we had here, 2 members commonality. This is not effective. And additional information, this policy is not being monitored, so it is ineffective. Also, it directly conflicts with policy 17. So here again, we're seeing like interlinks that are happening or not happening. Things are meshing or not meshing. Let me see what the staff had said. There is an exception to the policy in City Code 2176, excuse me. If the sewer main is not adjacent or abutting this property, then sewer connection is not required. This is not applied to subdivisions, but is applied to individual lots in areas without master sewer mains. So I think that's pretty much an overall run of it. Obviously, there's more work to do. I'm going to jump back to the PowerPoint. You were here on the matrix. So initial findings on this policy on the matrix. It has been established that work and recommendations are needed on the water budget 1 through 14. That was already established. We could see the challenges that were happening on the 20th. The water budget policies referred council to subcommittee already. So the subcommittee has entertained an appeal, and that will be moving forward to council. So that's already in motion. So we can work to better futures, but I think you're already moving that project. And the policies, this is really funny language, but you have policies within a policy. So the policies, we're responding to commissioners and staff had commonality where policy numbers 10 through 17 is where we could see some coordination. Both note that they were not effective and or gave comments. Most policies need more input from the commission to evaluate which should be addressed first and how to organize the work. So I think really that's the bottom line on that piece right now is we have something to work with 2 members that have fully executed their homework. I work with them when we have our hour a month to see if I can get more people moving on certain things.
Mayor, could I ask a question?
Sure.
Leslie, from your presentation, and particularly from the beginning of the presentation, it almost sounds like this group really didn't understand what they were there for. It almost sounds, it is the Water Commission or the Mayor's Commission for Water Policy Review.
And monitoring.
And it almost sounds like they thought they were going to be the city's water czars. And, I think that as you get into it, I think that they had a clearer understanding. But do you feel like you've had to kind of between the chairman and yourself, you've had to kind of reel the committee back in?
So I think this happens with all groups, and that's why I tried to set them a structure, because everybody is excited. You've been asked by the mayor to participate, and a lot of those people have a lot of background in various aspects of water. Mm-hmm. So yeah, we took the time and we made sure that we were doing that. I think you're going to have this with every group. There's a forming stage, and then they kind of storm a little bit. They're not quite sure what they're doing, and you can have some arguments where, well, I want to do this, and she wants to do that, and then you start to normalize, and I think we're starting to normalize a little bit, and then you start performing. And so I think that, unfortunately, they get 1 hour a month, and staff is working on this, and that's why the staff perspective was important, is that they're working on this daily. You know, they're taking in an application, they're seeing how the policy works. So, you know, I wouldn't say necessarily reeling in, but I wanted to make sure that as they would say the things they wanted, I'd say, you know, we can take that and we're going to have to table it. You know, when we know, you know, that we're going to attack these 3 policies because they're the most important, or these don't mesh, these, you know, these conflict, you know, then we can do more. So overall, I think you have a really good group.
Okay. Question 2 is, when there's an appeal and the appeal is granted and it's not subtracted from the semi-annual water budget, where does it get subtracted from?
I think that question has come up as well, and I think staff is working on that. The deputy director and others are, you know, what are you subtracting that from? I'm not certain. I didn't write that memo that came to you on the 20th. So unfortunately, I can't say how that's going to be subtracted, but the bottom line is within policy, there's a volume that was determined, and then that volume is where you're subtracting off your 25. And then I'm assuming that will be also the place where you subtract off this appeal area. So it was actually Mayor Pro Tem Montoya who brought that up, I believe, at the Water Issues Committee and said, I'd like you to flesh that out. So staff's working on that now. Some of the challenges I think you have with your policy is it didn't necessarily provide all the connectivity. You know, it was like, okay, here's a policy, we're going to do this, but it didn't necessarily have the background to actually execute it, potentially. So I don't know if you have any more questions. I'm happy to answer them, or I can move to the next slide and talk about the 2019 and 22.
And you wanted
Or
to
Gwen would like to approach
Fill
it.
in some of the blanks.
So I think I'll see if I can answer the question about where does the water come from. And I did answer this question at the subcommittee meeting as well. And I think in some respects, we're still in the checkbook mentality of we have 100, we gave 25, we gave 25, and now we only have 50 left, right? But in 2018-19, we switched from the checkbook to the water resource management model. And the model is based on utility billing data that's actually flowing through the meters. So even though we're looking at, we'd only like to estimate and, you know, basically set aside this much water as new development comes in, the worm is constantly tracking the actual water use. Water conservation's been very effective in this community, and that's why 20 years later, we don't use that much more water than we did 20 years ago, but we have a lot more people here, right? And so even though we're setting aside that 25 acre feet, right, for a 6-month period, that doesn't mean when we update the worm each year that the worm will show that we're using 25 more acre feet. We may actually be using the same or less, or we may be using more, but the worm is what tells us what we're actually using. So we have to shift the way that we look at water, because we've made a shift in how we're tracking our water usage from the way we used to do it to the way we do it today, which is in the model, which is based on drops of water that go through the water meter. So that's what we need to be focused on, and not be focused on, you know, we're minusing. Because of course, we are allowing more people to connect to our system and use water, but the people who are using water are also using less. So that's the answer we gave at the Water Issues Subcommittee.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear that when we first established the 0.35 for single-family homes, a lot of that was just based on kind of a reasonable projection, but it wasn't really based on data that we could support such a number. So once the worm was started to be used, we were able to analyze the actual usage in a more justified manner. And that's why we were able to ratchet down those numbers. And again, those are averages. for all single-family homes and all multifamily units. And as the technology advances, as appliances and fixtures become more efficient, we'll probably see the usage numbers based upon real data even further modified, so that we can do progressively more efficient utilization of our water resources, so that we can balance growth with modern subdivision development and even individual single-family homes or small apartment developments. I mean, I think a perfect example, and we're going to be looking at this a little later today, is the Palmer multifamily development over there, where the same developers who developed the Winfield at the Ranch project have like 2 years of usage based upon the same type of high efficiency fixtures and appliances. But we apply the 0.12 to this new development when they can probably show that they use substantially less. So that's an example of how this whole process is going to evolve. And that's what the purpose of this commission is to look at the policy, try to make it as efficient and effective as possible as we develop more and more data to design the policy to be as efficient as it possibly can. So, you know, if you compare it 7 or 8 years ago, when we were just kind of saying, well, this seems like a pretty good number, let's start with this. Why? Well, just because it seems like a pretty good number, right? and now we're getting much more data-driven, and I think the WORM is going to provide us with even more efficient analysis of how we use water and how best to use it in the future. So it's going to take a while to get up to speed. And I think the council, as we continue to make decisions on allocations and potential appeals, we're going to be able to have more justified recommendations coming from this committee. But it doesn't happen overnight. And at the same time, while they're trying to refine their understanding of it, you know, we've got development that's going along. Yeah. It's not like we just say, okay, time out. We're going to review this policy and make it as effective as possible over the next 6 months. Well, there's development that needs to be going, needs to be approved and analyzed in the interim, and we've got to be able to try to do our best in that during that period of time. Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor. Leslie, I think it is useful to see that matrix for me to kind of understand what the commission is kind of looking at in terms of the policy and what their thoughts are. I would sure like to see more than 2 people's opinion, though. And I guess that's my question is there a way is there things that can be done to aid this group so that we can get a broader set of data from them? And maybe, I guess my frustration in that meeting on the 20th that you referenced last year is that it would have been nice before we had the discussion about the appeal process to have had them had a discussion about the appeal process so that we could be aware of their deliberations. Maybe they've asked some questions that we were thinking of or gave staff time to think of. I guess kind of going back to what Councilman Sichka said, I really think that the way this group can work most effectively for council is for them to do some of the work of vetting this policy and making it better, or having those big conversations about these things. And I sure would love to see them kind of hash some of this stuff out, even if those conversations might not, you have a diverse group of people there who might have different opinions about it. Various policies. I think that leads us to better policy. So I guess the only thing I would say is I love seeing the matrix. I love seeing what people are thinking about. I just sure would like to know what the broad consensus among all of them is. That would be helpful for me.
Yep, absolutely. So they were given it as homework, and so they had a month, to work on it. We brought it back to the next meeting, and I offered it again and said, if you didn't have time to do this, then please note, gave them hard copy, give me some feedback. So that was the second person. So, I can do the best I can, but, I can't make them do their homework.
Councilmember Rusing.
So,
Thank you. For your first quarterly report, there's a lot of valuable information in here. And already on item number 3, estimated usage by project, has identified that, for example, out at the air park, it's an industrial area. Why do we need a bunch of fancy landscaping out there that's just going to use more water? And by changing our code, we can do that and even make our water portfolio even more efficient. So I think there's a lot of, we're off to a good start here, and they raise a lot of important questions. And I think that I just want to thank you for all your efforts, and thank you to the commission.
That's a good example.
So we can touch back. Gwen would probably know too. I don't think the commission knew that there was a potential for a project to need the appeal process. Do you remember when Palmer came in needing, was their application in November or December?
Well, they went through PAC, but earlier in the year, but we never know if those actually come to fruition. So we didn't actually have an application in from Palmer until sometime in October. So we didn't, until we were implementing that policy, we didn't realize we had a stumbling block to get past, if you will. And that's how a lot of things come up that we just didn't anticipate it until we were trying to implement it, so.
So your committee wouldn't have known either,
Right.
and I wouldn't have known because I don't work through Gwen's process. I'm not in her process of permitting, and the folks in the permitting center who do that. So if say, we hate to put a certain project on discussion, but if they had a PAC and if they were holding, maybe waiting for a policy, to come to play, then they would have filed at a later date, but they would have been out there as a potential. So it is tricky. I wanted to
Councilwoman
get back.
Cantemi?
Oh, go ahead.
Did you want to finish?
Can I follow up on the mayor's comment? So
Okay.
part of that 0.35 is important because I think that, you need to realize that was part of your DNO, your decision and order number. It wasn't a number out of the ordinary of it was 150 gallons per person per day so that there could be a planning horizon for a certain volume for a number of people. Your water resource management model that we started working on back in early 15, but didn't pick up steam until 16. That was an internal tool so we could see what our population was actually doing. But your 0.17, doesn't have a margin of safety on it. It doesn't have a little bit of cushion there. It's a straight up number, and you're hoping that everybody's going to kind of hold to that. We are probably going to have some more questions on that as we move through our decision and order process that you're in right now at the state, as to how that, 0.17 that we offered into the DNO process, how that is looking to them and how they typically allocate, because they're not going to run you right to the wire. They're going to say, okay, so is your 0.17 also covering landscaping, or are you covering that somewhere else, your parks, how, within your subdivisions? They look at things maybe differently than you have looked at with your policy changes. So I'm sorry, Councilwoman can't tell me. I just wanted to
That's okay.
help with that aspect.
That actually falls a little bit along the lines that I was going to say. I was going to ask a different question, but the mayor, in your commented on a packet that we've got coming up here. And as everybody knows, I have been just a huge advocate of basically the, data mining. He's right, as this takes shape, everything that will reveal out of, keeping track of some of the, the multifamily units that are already built, tracking what they're using, the changes in the construction industry in terms of the fixtures, all of that will start to paint a picture, basically. So I would encourage the group and your, department to do as much data collection as possible. I sat up last night and read this thing. If anybody gets a chance, this is online. The information that came out of this packet here, even as it is concerned to water, is amazing information. This is the kind of, this was really in depth, but if we could even do 1/4 of this in your department in terms of, the data that's collected and how we mine that that information, it really opens our eyes to what is actually happening with our water usage, and it is developing right now as we look through this committee, but start to collect some of the information on these big multifamily, projects that are coming in front of us. But that can go down, obviously into the planned area developments, single-family homes. By the time we collect all this and start to read it correctly, we're going to know what we need per project almost ahead of time. So I think it's a great thing to be able to analyze the usage and start to collect that and be able to present that to the council or even planning and zoning. Everybody needs to have that because that is going to tell us where we're going. So thank you for doing that. I think it's a great idea. Let's just collect all of that data somehow.
Thank you, Councilwoman. I'm sure Gwen's listening to all this and saying, okay, well, how she wants to run as a Deputy Director of Public Works and how our permit center will collect information and things like that.
We have to have it. Yeah, we're finding out, all the big companies in the country can't, and myself included, I could never, ever move the direction of my company into a successful realm without that data. We have to have it, and we have to have it as a city. I think that's going to help paint a really clear picture for all of us on every single issue we're talking about if we have that, but in particular, that hot button item of water.
Yeah, and I think you'll have to make a decision of when you've allocated everything that you have, even if you have lower uses over the years, there's going to come a point where you've used up your water. It's all in play. So when is that? And I think that's some of the challenges that people maybe don't realize about the worm is that, it can only go so far. It can bring in data from your billing set, but then you're also looking at, I think is what the Water Issues Committee was looking at, is when do we know that we've expended everything? It's all in play. And you need to be looking for that as well.
Well, that'll be a good indication in the future when we have to start looking for other sources as well. Thank you.
Correct, yeah. Proceed. I'll move quickly. So we did this quick comparison because I felt that maybe our commission wasn't quite sure about the range of water policies and actions a community could take. So just I put this on as draft because I didn't get a lot of feedback on this. But when you just look at them side by side, a 2019 policy that was in use and a 22 policy is the one that's in use now. It's not really about the page count or anything. It's about the content and how staff can operate it and how it supports the city's interests and what their development community needs, your economics. So in the 2019 policy, there wasn't really a water budget stated. In this policy, it goes back to 50 overall. So you can see some changes. The water allocation process was that water would be provided in 2019 policy, but no specific amount would be allocated to the project through separate contract. And then if you step down the next level, it says volumes associated with contracts or contract amendments were roughly, 1,800 was put into use. The 22 policy is, looking at 25, for residential, non-residential, and the allocation's looking kind of different. So is one policy more effective for moving water into the community? Is another one still effective, but it takes a different approach? And there's just some basic thoughts to look at through this. But the next part was, okay, once you look at the 22 management policy and then long-term management plan. And so we stumbled on this a little bit at our last meeting because people started thinking that the commission was going to build this, and it wasn't really that. I thought I made it fairly clearly. We were just doing some comparisons so they could see an example of more and most communities are moving. They're there or moving that way is their long-term planning. And part of your water resource management model was to work into a long-term planning stance. But right now it's really just used as it's a 0.17, a 0.12, kind of that activity with it. Let's see if there's any other items here. I'll just move ahead. So this comparison, we had 4 members that were able to join. We had inclement weather on that day, so everybody was trying to figure out how to get there or get there virtually. The general agreement that the 22 policy, in comparison to the 2019 policy, is that the 22 policy is more effective for water management. And that's what your group had said. We did a roll call. General agreement that when the 22 policy is compared to an example long-term water management plan, that the commission may recommend to the city that they look towards long-term planning. And some pieces, and here again, your members are not doing this day to day, bless their hearts, and that's why it's a little bit of a struggle when they get an hour here and then an hour next month, is that, part of your DNO was one of your stances the city took long ago for long-term planning. And you're in that right now with your amendment or your modification, is you're looking at a 20-year horizon. And so we'll have to see how that shakes out. I try to incorporate member comments when I can, and this one said, this was an example here. The member said, here's a response to your comparing 2019, 22, and Tucson. And so Tucson was just one example of a long-term plan that I gave him the table of contents to say, what do you think? He says, Tucson is now recharging its aquifers. Tucson is now considered the #1 city in the world for regeneration of water. They also had a very well-done public meeting on August 22nd and are increasing their efforts for their water portfolio and policy. What stands out most to me in comparing the three, which there is no real comparison, is this. And he quoted this. In determining how to best use available water resources to meet projected demands, a scenario planning procedure was used to develop this longer horizon plan. And this document, they update on a regular basis. So they don't just build it and then walk away from it, and that's the same thing the city would have to do. So here again, you can see that even with specific requests to say, compare this to this, and then compare this to this, a member took another approach and said, I just compared all three of them. And so this is what I think. And that's fine too. So I hope you understand that I'm working with 7 different individuals, and they have different ways of approaching the work they believe they've been tasked with. And I believe they're making efforts, even when there's not, maybe the information we were hoping for, to get done in the time frame that we're also hoping for. I left this open for members. We just met last week. An email went out I think it was just yesterday, reminding them that there was a study session if they wanted to add some more comments. And so some of them, said, well, I could, but I'm not sure if I could be there. But they sent me a little bit more in their work. And one of the comments they said to me, so I'll read it for them since they can't be here. I agree using the current general plan for parameters is a good idea. So of course you're going to have linkages there. You have an active process going on. Another one said, and this was some of the early on too, but it's come back up. It says, complete the work started by Public Works Director Mr. Couch regarding the accountability for water pumping from the Easy Street station. Consider passing a regulation that water being pumped must be used in the Prescott AMA. So while you're taking in all these billing points and, for your worm, you have other parts that are operating within the city's system as well that potentially would be useful. That was an example of something we put down because we were trying to get at the meat of the policy and look at 1 through 22. Member said, provide council with a list of all existing water contracts and or agreements, no matter how old, and indicate whether or not they are still active or have been complied with. Provide enough detail to answer the how, what, wheres. So I think there's maybe less clarity on some of the newer contracts that have been written under the 2019 policy. So we could bring that forward, but at the same time, it's going to be tricky to work in that kind of discussion while we're working on policies 1 through 22. So that's the status of the group and what they're working towards, and I'm happy to answer any questions. We'll be back in a quarter, and hopefully we'll have 3 solid meetings between now and then.
Councilmember Rusing.
Thank you, Leslie. I also found it quite exciting that they brought up the aspect of a long-term water management plan. Would that be just for Prescott or for the the Prescott AMA or the Quad Cities or
They were speaking specifically to the city.
to the
So
city?
the city doing long-term planning, which you have some elements of it, but,
Okay.
you know, kind of a more of a regional, a Prescott AMA plan, that comes down from the state. And then we
Okay.
can engage in different ways that way.
Because I read in the paper that with the new administration down in Phoenix, they're tackling a lot of water issues, and one of the things they mentioned was a long-term water management plan for the whole state. Did I get that right?
That's correct.
So maybe we can kind of work hand in hand with them if we proceed with a long-term plan. And then another thing I wanted to ask is, were there any comments about the element in the water policy about providing water to annexed areas only?
Not yet. I think you have within policy a statement about water outside, or whether it's annexed or not annexed. But they haven't had a chance to make any
All righty.
recommendations on
Thank
that,
you.
unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think I've made a couple of comments to the committee itself because I know there are some members that have broad experience with water understanding and involvement, and they want to kind of leap far ahead. And I think I'm trying to kind of reel them in and say, let's make sure the policy we have in our city right now is as effective and appropriate as it can be. And then once we've kind of achieved that goal or approaching it, then we can look at some broader issues like long-term water management and maybe even making possible recommendations to our neighboring communities on conservation issues and other things like that that might have some solid justification from the data we're working on. So I know that you've read comments from the members, and I see that we have one member in the audience here that might want to.
Thank you. I hadn't turned
Is,
backwards and don't have eyes in the back of my head.
Michael, do you want to make any comments regarding some of the other comments that were read?
Mayor, members of the council. Really, I'm just here to support Leslie today and just to hear the feedback from the council on the commission. I think the comments that were made about us being kind of slow and getting started have been spot on. Feels like we're becoming a little more cohesive. But I would offer and suggest that maybe direction be given to Leslie that an hour a month is not enough. We barely, an hour meeting is pretty brief. And maybe there's intermediate emails that go out with requests for comment or information back from the commissioners as maybe a way to accelerate this process a little bit. So that's really the only comment I had today.
Well, that
Can I
might
just say
be
that's an
worthy
excellent
of,
point. So we did, and I didn't bring it up. I've had a couple members, and at the get-go, we would meet, virtually to get somebody up to speed, or if somebody missed a meeting. And then recently, I've had a member that said, "I need to sit down and talk to you." And so I said, "Sure, I'm here. We can sit down and talk. We can get on the phone." And so if those kind of intermediate, we just have to be careful of quorum. We can't be, so if a member comes to me and says, I need to sit down and talk to you about this some more, the door has been open. But I think it's sometimes, there was some uncertainty, like, I'm not sure if I really know what I'm talking about. I don't want to waste time, and I don't want to waste your time. I said, we're fine. We can talk. Let's talk about your question. So thank you for bringing that up. I forgot.
Thanks, Michael. Do we have any public comment?
We do not.
All right, well, thank you very much, Leslie.
Thank you.
We're looking for significant advancement in some of their deliberations and recommendations, so I think we're starting to get a pretty decent foundation, and as things progress, I think the council will be very appreciative of some of the information and recommendations that come from the committee. Thank you. All right, let's move to our second item on the agenda. Presentation and discussion regarding council priorities and use of opioid settlement disbursements.
Thank you, Mayor. Joseph Young. As council knows, we've been involved in some litigation regarding the opioid epidemic. And so today, the distributions are starting to be made, some of the initial payments, and we need to start making a few decisions on how to use these funds. Specifically today, we want to ask or seek direction on whether those funds should come from the county to the city, or whether we allocate our funds to the county for them to spend, and they have offered a proposal. But a little bit of history first. As the opioid epidemic began to take place and show itself, a lot of different government entities started initiating litigation, and most of those were wrapped up into one single litigation in Ohio called the multi-district litigation, or MDL. At about after the MDL was formed, a lot of the Arizona entities started also suing, and it wasn't everybody. And there's a lot of pushback from some of the government entities, but Prescott got in fairly early, along with some of the other government entities. And part of the issue there was trying to avoid the MDL and maybe bring litigation in local courts. But eventually the state stepped in, the state attorney general's office, and entered into a settlement agreement with the distributors called the One Arizona Agreement. It was signed on by all of the counties in the state, the distributors, and almost all of the cities and towns as well, but not everyone. So the structure, the One Arizona Settlement Agreement has become the structure that basically we'll be discussing today, and it kind of colors everything we do in terms of the opioid settlement distributions. And the first two distributions for 2022 and 2023 are in, and they're at the county level. And so the year one distribution is for allocation to the city of Prescott is $66,962. And for year two, it's $101,150. So we're talking about a total of, at this point, of $168,000 roughly. The total for the initial litigation with, or settlement with Johnson & Johnson is $1.8 million for the city of Prescott over about 17 years. And like I said, that's just Johnson & Johnson, and Janssen is in now. There's other bankruptcies that have gone place, Purdue, Mallinckrodt, and a few other entities. And we are in pending litigation with others, and settlement agreements have worked out, but the distribution mechanism hasn't. So right now, we're just talking about those initial distributions. So under the One Arizona Agreement, the county's in charge of dispersing the fund. The county's also in charge of reporting. And for Yavapai County, it's the Yavapai County Community Health District. And if there is unanimous agreement between all the signatories within a county, it can be spent in a number of different ways by the county, essentially. If there is no unanimous agreement on how that's done, then the distribution goes directly to the city, and the city is in charge of distributing it or spending it according to the One Arizona Agreement. And so you have before you in the backup packet the Exhibit C to the One Arizona Agreement. And Exhibit C lays out, and we'll go over some of the major categories, but that lays out all of the ways that the funds can be spent. It all relates to opioid use and treatment, but I'll get into that a little bit in a second. So based on that agreement, the counties reached out to each of the cities and towns within Yavapai County and asked if there was interest in a unanimous agreement that the money stays with the county and gets paid directly to PANT, which is Partners Against Narcotics Trafficking. It's essentially the area narcotics task force. And that is one option. And essentially, that's, as I mentioned, that's why we're here to determine if you want to leave the discretion of our county or to receive the distributions directly to the city. And based on the formula in Exhibit C, and we'll go over, like I said, a little bit of the areas. So the money can be spent for treatment strategies, which is essentially treating opioid use disorders, supporting people in recovery, supporting treatment, connecting people to the help that they need, addressing the needs of criminal justice involved persons. And so those are treatment strategies. That's the one section. The next is prevention strategies, which includes a lot of education, prevention of overprescribing, the prevention of the misuse of opioids, and then other strategies, which include first responders. So anything to our first responders, police department, fire department, as it relates to opioid epidemic, including treatment, crime fighting, and so forth. Leadership, planning, and coordination of different, and research, creation of programs that can address the issue. So within that framework, it's pretty broad in what the money can be spent on, but it has to be related to opioid, either in education, prevention, or in fighting the epidemic itself. And at this point, as I mentioned, we're looking to get direction and then come back with a motion of whether the money is to come to the city or stay with the county. If it comes to the city, that doesn't preclude you from giving the money or a portion of it to PANT, for example, because they clearly have a goal and a need of fighting against this opioid epidemic. So at this point, if you have any questions, I'm willing to answer them. Matt Podracki, Deputy City Attorney, was at the meeting that discussed this topic, and he can answer some questions as well. And really, the question is discretion. So the benefit with letting the county deal with it is we don't have to report, but we also lose our discretion. If it comes to the city, we have to spend within the parameters. We have to report to the county how we spent it, but we have more discretion on how we do that.
Well, let me start off by giving you a little background. When Mayor Oberg was the mayor here, he appointed me as co-chairman of his Structured Sober Living Home Committee. At that time, our representative at the state legislature, Noel Campbell, was able to move through a bill in the legislature that was signed, and it gave us broad discretion to be able to deal with the serious impacts that the city of Prescott was dealing with. We had north of 250 sober living homes distributed throughout the neighborhoods in our community. And when you figure the average number of people in those homes were 6 or 7 or 8, there were literally thousands of people that had come to Prescott to try to deal with their addictions and try to find a way to go through treatment and successfully exit those addictive impacts on their personal lives. Well, we also saw that the treatment effectiveness was not all that impressive, and many of those people failed in their attempts and then ended up on the streets of the city with many, many impacts to homelessness and other areas related to crime. So because we were given the authority through the state statutes or the laws that were passed, we did a very significant job of impacting those areas, and we were able to reduce the number of sober homes over that period of time from, like I said, north of 250 down to about 30, and that's about where they stand today. I think our last analysis was about 31 of those homes, and I think most of them, for the most part, are doing a pretty good job of trying to do legitimate treatment for people that are still in the throes of addictive conditions in their lives. And now we have the expanded concerns about opioid in the fentanyl area. And there's still problems with oxycodone and hydrocodone. So my point was that when we were dealing with this issue, we had by far the biggest impact of any community in northern Arizona, certainly within Yavapai County. And I made numerous comments to the county about how they were going to try to deal with the impact of proliferation of these homes within the county. And I was told several times that they didn't have a problem because they used their zoning powers to eliminate the use of any commercial homes that would be dealing with this population. So their impact was very minimal. Now we finally receive a disbursement of opioid settlement funds. And even though we had by far the biggest impact, and we actually contacted the county and said, we should be entitled to a substantially larger amount of these funds, since we had to deal with the biggest impact of any area within the county. So the results were that we weren't given any additional funds. The county decided to retain the vast majority of the funds, and our allocation was purely based upon population. And that's why we're being allocated 13.8% of these funds, and the county is receiving, 69% of them?
Close to that.
Right. So the county decided to have a meeting and recommend that all the funds made available to the different municipalities go completely to support Partners Against Narcotics Trafficking, PANT. And let's face it, PANT does a very effective job in interdicting and dealing with a lot of the criminal activities and illegal drug distribution within the county. But I think it's really, when you consider what the impacts were, the county was able to really retain substantial funds to be able to support PANT. And I think we, at this point, at least have the option of deciding for ourselves how best to use the remaining small amount that's being allocated to us, so that we can actually use it for the ongoing needs that we have within the city in this area of drug use, proliferation, and ongoing impacts that we're seeing with the growing fentanyl problem and even a resurgence of methamphetamines. So with that said, that kind of gives you some background, and we can now discuss it. Council Member Rusing.
Thank you. As you may know, we've decriminalized people that are addicted to drugs. And then the federal government has incentivized their treatment by providing billions of dollars for rehab and therapy. So I noticed on page 16 of the packet, part 3, paragraph 1, first responders, current and future law enforcement expenditures relating to the opioid epidemic. And that really caught my eye. And then looking at the PANT letter, they zeroed in on this. And I think this would be the most effective way to spend the money, because the problem's been decriminalized, incentivized, but PANT focuses on the root of the problem, which is the dealers, the drug dealers. And I think they have a huge battle on their hands, but we just heard a talk by them last night, and I think they're doing a wonderful job, and I feel that this is where the money should go, with the caveat that maybe focus more, a little more on Prescott, since we're contributing 13% back to them. Thank you.
Councilman Moore.
Thank you, Mayor. Joe, I just have a question. As I read through the packet, I was a little confused by the numbers, because it talks about the 13.79%, and it gives a dollar amount that we're going to get on page 4, which is different than a dollar amount on page 22, which is different than a dollar amount on page 27. So I'm just confused about the money, because it's talking about like 135,000 will be the first. Oh, that's to the county. I'm sorry. Prescott, 335,000. That's on page 27 versus a different amount on page 22 versus what you mentioned, I think, on page 4. So I was kind of questioning the dollar amounts, because there's several different amounts listed in different places. So that was my question, more than the allocation of where it should go, whether we should retain it or whether it should go to the county.
So we do have a few different numbers, and part of that is because we started with Johnson & Johnson settlement, and then the Janssen funds are also been added to it for some of the numbers. But having said that, I don't know if Lars is here, or maybe Mark.
Yeah, Lars is here too, and he's the expert. I just put up the complete distribution for the year one. There's 2 distributions each year. And of course, Prescott is highlighted there.
I think, Mayor, just based on the amount of money we're receiving, I see a lot of value in us keeping the money internally within our city, but then there's the reporting and the oversight and keeping track, and I'm kind of wondering if it's not more easily just kept track of if we return it back to the county and continue to let PANT use those funds, just because then we would have the reporting responsibility if we retain the funds, and that would just add a layer of administration to the city that maybe we don't currently have.
Well, I think it's pretty clear that some of the very small communities who are receiving a very tiny amount of distribution probably totally agree with that.
Yeah.
Just being able to have staff put together reports necessary probably isn't even worth their consideration. But I think when you look at the long-term total distribution of funds coming from these agreements, we're probably in a better position to be able to do that. And maybe we should hear from whoever is going to be doing the reporting how much time or effort is going to be involved.
And I don't think we've assigned anyone that would be in charge of that yet. It would have to be a directive through the city manager's office. I don't know if you've thought about it, but I think one other point of clarification that's relevant is this decision of whether the money comes to Prescott and then we decide what to do with it, or whether it stays with Yavapai County, is not for the full 17 years. It will be for the first two disbursements. So it's a decision that can change, but in terms of who's going to do the reporting, that hasn't been signed out yet.
I would assume it'd probably be a collaborative effort between the finance department and the police department.
Yeah, I would imagine these funds would be distributed as part of your annual budget discussions, Mayor. Obviously, we do the accounting for the city, so we would keep track of it in a separate trust fund for the uses. And then I don't know what's involved in the reporting. It's probably just a matter of sending a list of the projects that we're funding with it to the county. I don't know too much about that, but I mean, we'll do what we do. We do reports all the time.
I think some of the activities that were described by the city attorney are things that we're already operating on and doing within the city. So it's not like we're going to be doing and creating new programs that take time and effort to administer. It's just a matter of putting a report together so that the funds can be justified within the city. And keep in mind, if we decide to have these funds come directly to us, we can still decide to allocate some or part of them to PANT's efforts. I know one of the concerns that the county had was that PANT had been receiving quite a bit of funds from those seizure programs where they were able to detain certain likely criminal activity members and then be able to take the financial proceeds and use them for funding their PAN activities. Do you want to describe that a little more?
Yeah, and the program we're talking about is civil asset forfeiture, or the area of law. And it was based on the theory that sometimes money and assets are so involved in a criminal activity that they should be forfeit and not necessarily tied to an individual's criminal activity. It's the assets themselves were involved in criminal activity. The law has since been updated in many ways, and including the most difficult that some people are having a hard time dealing with is a creation of a civil liability for the prosecuting agency and the prosecutor that initiates civil asset forfeitures if there's something wrong with it. The other part, and kind of another substantial part, is the law now requires a criminal conviction to go along with civil asset forfeiture. So it just changed the lay of the ground, and people aren't doing, prosecuting agencies, namely county attorney's offices, are not doing civil asset forfeitures to the extent they used to be.
Councilwoman Ken tell me.
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to point out, too, I also sat on Mayor Oberg's Sober Living Homes Ad Hoc Committee. And through the committee, as our mayor here said, we took a deep dive into this subject. And the reason I got involved in it, I just want to remind everybody, is because I lived down here in the downtown area where most of these homes just proliferated. And I just want to shine a light on the fact that we did the House Bill 2107 that our legislator Noel Campbell was able to get through, and then our former city attorney crafted an ordinance based on that House bill, was what is called a permissive bill. And they did go to some of the other municipalities and offer the municipality to jump on board with that House bill, and some of the municipalities chose not to do that, by the way. But I want to shine a light on the fact that with this money, this allocation of money, if it were up to me, and I hope it is, I would like to see 3/4 of that money stay here in the city and go to our police department and our fire department. They're the first people, the first responders. Every time there was a call, and I had 57 recovering addicts on my street at that time, every time there was a call, these young men and women have to show up to a great cost to our taxpayers to be able to prop up this industry and take care of this protected class of people. To the detriment of the neighborhoods. We need to supply our police and our fire with the tools they need, because remember, we're just a few months away from opening a jail as well, and we are going to see a bigger impact with the diversion programs. So I'm in favor of keeping a minimum of 3/4 of that money here in our city for our police department and our fire to get themselves geared up to be able to handle what will surely come with the opening of the jail. But I have no problem at all with some of that money going to PANT. Kathy's right. We were at a meeting last night where the director of PANT spoke. There is no question that they have made a big dent in what we have here. But do not forget who these first responders are. They are the first ones. They need the tools. We've had incidents of police and fire coming in close contact with that fentanyl and having to have Narcan put in their veins immediately at that moment. This is a very, very serious problem. It's not just Prescott, it's countrywide, it's worldwide, really. But if we have an opportunity now to counteract some of the cost and deflect some of the injury that was sustained in our city, I think that that money has to stay here. We prop up our first responders so that they are ready to be able to handle this epidemic that we have here in our city and everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councilman Tenney.
Would it be appropriate to hear from our chief of police regarding her recommendation for how we might allocate this money?
You're asking me for an opinion?
Yes.
Whoops. Hopefully the new city hall will have a better microphone. I thank you for that, Councilman Tenney, for that opportunity. And this is an interesting position we find ourselves in. We're getting this infusion of money and trying to determine really what we're going to do with it. And I think the silver lining in this is that there really isn't a bad direction we can go with this. I will tell you that, just for a little bit of background on PANT, it is a regional task force. It's a county-wide task force that is made up of police officers and detectives from many different agencies within the county. And you're correct, they are extremely effective, but they are also, we're working on how we're going to continue funding them into the future. And the regionalization of those efforts is really important because, as you know, the drug dealers, the crime is cross-jurisdictional. It doesn't just stay in Prescott Valley. So that cooperation is really, really important. With the reduction in the RICO funds that we've seen, the civil asset forfeiture, we really are kind of painted into a corner of how we're going to continue to support those efforts of PANT because we know it is really important. So PANT is facing a couple of challenges, primarily the funding and also staffing, right? So how do we continue to infuse that task force with funding and people so that they can continue that important work they do? To your point, Councilwoman, in terms of what we can do, there's a lot of different things we can do here locally, and we trust your judgment and direction when it comes to the best use of those funds. And, we get creative and we adapt and overcome to the challenges that we're facing when it comes to enforcement. So there are different tools, there are different investigative methods we can use. We can look at all sorts of different creative ways to use that money. But I would agree that at least initially helping to support PANT is definitely a good option for us.
So may I? So to clarify, Amy,
if we were to give some or all of these funds to the county to be used for PANT, that's still a direct benefit to your department, your officers, and the citizens of Prescott, yes?
It absolutely is. We currently do not have a detective assigned to PANT. We have a position assigned to PANT, but we, as we've talked about, had to pull that person back to support our patrol bureau. But absolutely, anything that goes to PANT is really, the best way to describe it is kind of a community cupboard, right? We all kind of throw our assets together and work on these cross-jurisdictional drug issues for our community. And so absolutely, an infusion to them would be helpful. It would give us some time as a group. We have a leadership group that meets once a month to talk about PANT and continue to lead that group of detectives and figuring out how we're going to continue to fund that and grow the mission of PANT. This would buy us a little bit more time to be able to support that.
Perfect. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, looking at Lars's analysis here, even in the year one, Yavapai County will get $336,000. Will receive a little under $67,000, and then the second year, that allocation goes all the way up to $508 for Yavapai County, and our number is a little over 101. So from my understanding and attending that meeting in December along with Matt Podracki, my understanding is PANT is kind of underwater by about $450,000. So that's the amount that their civil asset forfeiture was lost. So to be able to maintain their funding, that's what they're looking for. So I think even looking at these numbers, it's pretty clear that Yavapai County can probably do the vast majority of funding necessary. They might be a little short on the first year, but I think if we decide to retain our ability to determine how best to use those funds within the city, we do have that option of doing some or a substantial amount to PANT. And then as the funding for the county grows, we may be able to allocate more to our local police department and fire department to make sure that our local citizens are getting the prompt and complete response they need to concerns in this particular area. Do we have any more concerns, questions? Any public comment?
No, Mayor.
So this is a study session. We're not making a decision here, but I think we have a pretty good idea where the council wants to go.
And we will be bringing a motion next council meeting to vote on one of the two options. And at that point, we can make that vote, but we wanted a little bit of direction at this point.
I don't know, should I poll the council, or is that a violation?
I think it's not a violation if it's just a poll of where you're standing right now, and it would help us know which motion to put before you.
And Joe, right now, they're just deciding, do they want the discretion to decide themselves or to leave it with the county, right?
Right, yeah, that's purely the direction here. So we'll start on my left. Connie?
I'm going to say what I said just a few minutes ago. I'd like to see a lot of that stay here locally. I would love to support PANT, but it has to stay in the enforcement category. The industry of rehabilitation is fully funded and then some. We need to prepare to keep our citizens safe and make sure our first responders are protected. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman Ken Tomey. Councilman Shishka?
I have no comment, Mayor.
No comment. Councilmember Roosing.
Thank you. After hearing Chief Bonnie speak, it sounds like she needs all of her resources to do their routine job, and so I would support this money going to PANT so that we don't have our local police force spending all their time cracking down on the drug dealers.
Well, what we're deciding is whether we retain the authority to be able to make those decisions. So if we retain the amount, we can then allocate it. The other option is not to retain it and allow the county to fully decide how the money's going to be used.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. I would like to have it all go to PANT eventually with a focus on Prescott.
So if I'm interpreting your answer correctly, does that mean you would like to have the city retain the discretion, and then once we decide how it's going to be used, you would like to see the majority go to PAN?
Yes, thank you.
Councilman Moore.
Thank you, Mayor. I think it's, since our city attorney has advised us that we can change our decision if we choose to in a year or two, I'm in favor of us initially selecting the option to retain the ability to decide where the money goes. So we would receive all the money and then we can decide where it goes.
Councilman Tenney.
I would say the same. It sounds like it really is a can't-lose situation in terms of it ending up in places where it's going to be most effective, but initially, some more flexibility on the part of the city to determine exactly how that money is spent. And I'm not hearing that the reporting pieces are going to be onerous for our current staff. That was a piece I had concern about as well.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem.
Clark really took a lot of the words that I would have to say about that. I think for me, it comes down to, I wrote down my question that got answered was, would it create an undue burden on staff for the reporting piece? And what I heard today is that no, it won't. And so I think it's certainly worth retaining our own capacity to decide later. The only caveat I'll throw out is that I just want to make sure that we're, if there's a way to support the regional cooperation from a county perspective, that we're seeking to do that. And it sounds like PANT does that. So, and we have the capacity to retain that. What we're deciding today is, do we keep the discretion? I think it makes sense to keep the discretion. I think going forward, as these sums get maybe a little bit larger, it's worth looking at a more global strategy to it.
Well, thank you. I think we have a clear direction here, and I think you're pretty obvious where I stand. I think we should retain the discretion to be able to analyze that.
I would like to voice my support for the rest of the council in maintaining the control of that money and having it go to PANT, but through us.
Right, and we'll determine how much of that we'll allocate each year. Thank you, Councilman Zizka. Very well, that concludes our study session today. So this study session is adjourned.